everybody. How's everyone doing? All right, hello. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you today, to be here with LeJacq and Eva. I'm Seth, LeJacq. I'm a maritime historian, because I'm tight. And I'm a history professor at Hunter College, CUNY. We're up on the Upper East Side, so not too far from here. I study what I call the queer age of sail. That's the title. I research people in sailing communities who didn't conform to sexual and gender norms. I'm actually not an expert on queer polar history. Most of what I know comes from Terror Camp and my friends who are involved in that, and an associated community queer history group that I work with in London, connected to the Maritime Museum, the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. So I was thinking that what would be most useful for me to do here today is to talk about some deeper historical background and provide some more context on queer maritime worlds for all of you. I'm really excited about some new research that I did over the summer. When I first was envisioning this talk, I had just finished that research like a day or two before we were supposed to actually do things in July. I've had a little more time to think about it, but I have been teaching that entire time, so I actually haven't had much of a chance to work through this material. So what I want to do is experiment a little bit today. I want to show you some of these sources, kind of think through them out loud with you a little bit, tell you some stories that I found in the archives, and see what we can learn from those. I also want to draw some connections between those sources and later history, up to our own time. So I'm going to think about some stuff that's much older than what we just heard about, way pre-Edwardian. I work on the age of sail, the period kind of 1450 to 1850 or so, when sailing ships are the most important mode of transportation, the only way to get across oceans. And let's think about kind of long-term history here. So how's that sound? Let's do it. Okay, so I want us to think about exploring queer maritime worlds. Seas and seagoing communities have been incredibly important places for queer people for a very long time. We can see that reflected all around us today, including in this city, one of the great port cities, a very queer port city as well. This is part of our history here in New York. The central argument that I want to make is pretty simple. It's that maritime communities have always been diverse in terms of gender and sexuality. And also, historically, they've often been remarkably tolerant of those forms of difference. And so we should not project the intolerance that we know in our own time back in the past. I'd like to add on to what you were saying there. We often assume that the past was worse in these ways. That's not always the case. Homophobia, transphobia, other things like that wax and wane in interesting ways. Okay. Awesome. I'm going to focus today on trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming histories. This history is really vital today. When I was doing this research over the summer, I marched in London Trans Pride against transphobia in Britain and here at home, including the very cruel recent UK Supreme Court decision. We're in a larger moment of trans panic right now, very specific trans panic, vilification of trans people around this Charlie Kirk assassination. In particular, we're in New York City, so I think we should name and shame the paper as well. New York Times has done really horrible stuff here.
Yeah.
As a human being, I'm really appalled by these developments, and as a historian, I'm particularly frustrated by this common claim that transing gender is something new, something that was invented in the last generation, the last decade, and in ways of talking about it as a social contagion, which is really dangerous. This infection disease model of queerness is dangerous, it hurts people, it leads to death. As is denying people's history, and this is a form of historical denialism, to again pick up on that point. People who say that there is no trans history are, at best, for being generous, just ignorant. So I want to give you some evidence tonight to prove that trans people have been around for a long time, and next time you hear that particular historical lie, you can cite this. You can point it to me. All right. I particularly like this Nelson's column picture with the trans story. It's beautiful down here. I don't know what Nelson would have made of this, but it seems appropriate. All right, so let me tell you about two people that I have been studying who prove that contention. So many of the sexual and gender identities that we know today, that we use today, didn't exist in the past, of course, right? People didn't call themselves gay, homosexual, or trans 300 years ago, which is when many historical actors lived. Those latter two terms didn't even exist yet. But we have many documented cases of people who transgender They moved from their assigned genders to different gender identities. So a few years ago, I discovered a sailor in Britain's Navy who had done exactly that. The sailor went under several different names or aliases, including William Morris. Morris got in trouble with the Navy authorities in 1803, but not for transing gender. That was incidental to the case. Instead, they committed a common, very serious crime in the Navy. They deserted from the Navy. I'm going to use they down here. I think this makes sense, although if you have feedback on that, talk to me. It'd be interesting to hear. The Navy was always desperate for sailors, so they tried many different measures, including forcibly conscripting sailors. This was a practice known as pressing or press ganging. This was a major complaint leading up to the American Revolution. It's in fact a complaint with the British that's mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. The Americans really didn't like that. Desertion was such a problem for the Navy, for the British Navy, that they regularly made examples of deserters with military trials and harsh punishments. You could even be hanged for deserting. So Morris's commander-in-chief chose to press charges in this case, and that's when officers discovered the sailors' gender nonconformity. They told investigators that they were what we would recognize today as non-binary, either male or female, and we can see in some of the records here interesting constructions of this. It's glossed as neutrality of gender in this source, which I'll tell you about in a second. Really interesting. But non-binary, they said they were neither male nor female. I've discovered several accounts of what happened in this case. One of the trial officials later published his version of the story, that's where this comes from, describing this as a claim of neutrality of gender. That official, Robert Liddell, suggested that Morris made the claim to try to get out of the trial. Perhaps on the logic that doesn't make a lot of sense, but it seems to be how Liddell understood it. The logic that the criminal code only applied to sailors, to men, seamen, and so if the claim was I'm not a man, the law doesn't apply to me. The Navy does not agree. Liddell says that the Navy had a team of surgeons inspect Morris's body. They apparently concluded that Morris had male genitalia, though not what they thought to be normal genitals. The sailor had, and this is a quote from the records, quote, very small testicles. This may be a hint that we should think about this in terms of intersex history as well, though it's impossible for us to really know, and I'll talk about some of the challenges of doing intersex history in a second. Now, a serious challenge of this history is that we very rarely have anything from the perspective of the actual gender non-conforming people. Their words seldom survive for us. That version of the story, the one that we were just looking at, came from a Navy official, and he was hostile to Morris. But we do have a record of just a couple of sentences from Morris's own lips, because the trial minutes, the manuscript record of the trial, contains the sailor's short defense, and this is in fact the entirety of it, so it's a very short defense. The defense refers not to general anatomy, but instead to sexual function. Now, sex workers, female sex workers, and male sex workers sometimes, were very common on ships when they were in port, and Morris apparently could not perform sexually as sailors were supposed to, with some of them, at least with one of them. I think that there's a lot that's really interesting in this, including how other sailors in the Navy treated this gender nonconformity. So we have evidence of teasing, but it wasn't policed or punished in any formal way. Morris got in trouble, in fact, a lot of trouble, for deserting, but there's no record of any additional policing or any punishment around gender. That wasn't the crime. Transing gender wasn't illegal in this setting. It wasn't illegal for men to sleep together. Any sexual contact between men was illegal. But there's no policing of gender in that way formally. All right, so I found this a few years ago, and I've been really interested to learn everything I can about this case. And I finally got the chance over the summer to try to trace Morris a little further. Now, the court found him guilty of desertion and sentenced them to a really severe flogging, 200 lashes with the cat of nine tails, the common flogging instrument that was used in the Royal Navy. I don't know if this was still the case with the Guardians, but in the period that I'm looking at was the cat of nine tails, a flogging instrument with 9 separate tails, 9 tails. That printed account in the case that we were looking at claims that Morris wasn't badly harmed by the flogging, though, and so we know that they survived it. So what happened next? So when I was in London over the summer, I tried to figure this out. I traced Morris in a set of sources. These are really interesting. They're called muster books. These are the handwritten volumes that ships would keep records of who was on the ship. I learned some valuable things from this. I was able to identify Morris. I observed the page here. You can see William Morris up at the top there. And there's some really interesting stuff here. So one thing we learned is that Morris was only 24 years old. Morris was young. But if you see Over on the right, AB, Morse is rated able. So their ratings for ordinary sailors, the lowest ratings are boy. We're going to, in fact, meet a ship's boy in a second. And landsman, somebody who has no skill at sea. Able is the highest rating for a common sailor. So that indicates to us that Morse had been at sea for a long time, years and years, and become an expert. Seaman's a complicated term to use there, but that would have been the rating. If you look at the end of the column 2, you see R there. R is for run. That's the indication that Morse deserted. We have a formal desertion date written down as well. And we also get a hint here of why the Navy prosecuted Morse. So over on the left here, we have a 5. That's an indication that Morse received what was known as the King's Bounty. So when Morse signed up and enrolled to the ship, they got £5 payment, which is quite a lot of money at the time. And so why prosecute a particular deserter? This particular deserter collected money for signing up to the Navy, and may in fact have deserted and signed up and taken the bounty several different times. So it's a particularly flagrant example of desertion. So the reason that they went after Morse, again, didn't have anything to do with gender nonconformity. Instead, it was taking his money and running. Now, the next case I want to tell you about is a newer one for me. I discovered this more recently, and I'm still thinking through how to make sense of this, so any thoughts you have would be really helpful for me. This one, I've only found one place where it's documented, so I only have a single version of this story. This comes from Surgeon's Journal. Now, all Navy vessels of sufficient size needed at least one naval surgeon, and eventually the Navy also required that they keep and send into London surgeons' journals, these handwritten journals recording the work that they had done. Many of these survive. There are hundreds and hundreds of them in London now. They're really, really incredible sources. It's a remarkable history of medicine collection. I teach history of medicine, that's one of my fields, so I've been thinking about this a lot. Now, this case we only know through the eyes of the surgeon, which is unfortunate because this is a case that fits into intersex history, and of course the organized medical community has a terrible history with intersex people. The case is from the Surgeon's Journal of one Robert Dixon, who served on HMS Dryad in the 1820s. The interesting thing here, though, is that although Dixon reported this case, he didn't treat what I think we can understand as an intersex condition as a medical problem here. And again, unusual gender status wasn't the problem. So let me explain. I'm going to walk you through this. So Dixon made a record of a young sailor named Samuel Tapper because the sailor got sick. In his entry on Tapper, and here's part of it, the handwriting is really rough here. Doctors always have really bad handwriting. I spent so much of my life trying to decipher doctor handwriting. It's hard. He lists Tapper having a fever. He describes Tapper as a boy. That was in fact Tapper's rank. He was a ship's boy. And as just 18 years old, quote, of brown complexion, an active and hardy lad. The surgeon reported the symptoms, the course of the illness, and his treatment, which was apparently successful. After a week, he discharged the boy to his duties on the ship. So far, just like all the other cases in this and many other journals, but then there's something really interesting. Surgeon Dixon reported something unusual after this. He reported his remarks on what he calls the curious formation of the subject. He went on to explain this injury that he frequently, that's his word, been asked to observe Tapper when the boy was swimming nude with the other ship's boys because of his unusual anatomy. The surgeon described this as typical male general anatomy, as well as breasts typical of a teenage girl of the same age. And I'm going to pause here to say I'm not going to go into more detail about his description because I'm very influenced by intersex writers and intersex theorists who observe that records like this are invariably exoticizing, eroticizing, and voyeuristic. So I think we should try to resist doing that same thing, even if the records themselves do that. But I summarized a bit of what's in there. In the journal, the surgeon explained that the episode in the sick bay, in the sick bay, gave him and his assistant the opportunity to examine Tapper's supposedly anomalous breasts. And they concluded their finding was that they were indeed female breasts rather than male mamillae, slipping into Latin a little bit there. This is a tradition we see in writing about sex and gender as well, use of Greek and Latin in strategic ways. So again, as with Morris, a medical inspection, but not a pathologizing one. The health issue was a fever, and when that abated, the sailor was sent back to his work on the ship. And Dixon made sense of the case not with medical sources, but with something very different. He points to art and ancient myth. And so this is the end of the case. This is what he closes with, in fact. I was incredibly interested to find this, in part because I taught a queer history class last semester at Winter, and we looked at a lot of Aphrodite statues. This is a figure from Greco-Roman mythology, from the Greco-Roman pantheon, who is a fusion of male and female with a mix of secondary sexual characteristics. And this was a very, very popular artistic subject for a long, long time. Now, given that this was in Florence, it's probable that it was this particular statue he was looking at. Dixon probably saw this statue in the Uffizi Gallery. You can find examples of other hermaphrodites art in a lot of different places. The Met has a whole bunch of them, including miniatures of the Borghese hermaphroditus, which is probably the most famous one that survives. Okay, I think there's a lot to say about this. One key preliminary observation I'll make, though, is that the surgeon had an easy way to make sense of someone like Tapper, and it wasn't medicalized, it wasn't pathologized. I don't even think it's stigmatizing here. It's not a negative point of reference. In fact, after spending a semester looking at these hermaphrodituses, my understanding of this is that it was supposed to be seen as appealing, at least in the ancient world, and the statues certainly tried to make the figure seem quite sexy. A little context here too, and in fact I think this goes well on the surgeon that we just met in the last talk. Naval surgery, especially when we're thinking about the early 19th century, was still a very, very low status pursuit, very low status in the medical profession. It was dangerous, it was very badly paid. You didn't become a naval surgeon if you could practice on land or if you could get an MD. The stereotype at this time was that naval surgeons were ignorant butchers. But we should notice this really interesting detail here. Dixon had himself seen the statue. He had been to the gallery, he had looked at it with his own eyes. He had been to Florence. Now, most British people, of course, couldn't do this. Most British people were incredibly poor, they were living on less than £10 a year at this point. But he's a sea surgeon. He doesn't have to go on the Grand Tour, he doesn't have to be an Oxford-educated man. Going to sea allows him to see the world. Sailors saw the world like few other people did in this period. They encountered gender and sexual cultures very different from their own, encountered diversity that most people anywhere at this time did not. Now, like with Morris, I would love to know what happened to Tapper, but I can't figure out what happened long term either. The sailors in the Dryads must have boats for a bit, but when the ship paid off, he disappeared, and I don't know what happened to him. It's hard to trace people. It's hard to trace these working sailors. The British Navy didn't have continuous service in this period, so when you signed up or when you were impressed, you went for a single commission of the ship, and then you were off. It can be very hard to find people, especially like Morris that used aliases, or like Tapper, they were somebody at the bottom of the social scale, just a ship's boy. Right, I found a lot of other cool stuff that I'd like to tell you about, but I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to go too long here. But I don't want to just leave things here because I think there are a lot of other important things to say about the much longer history that stretches from the age of sail to the Edwardian period and up until today. There's a centuries-long, really profound, deep connection between queer people and queer communities and seafaring. Again, this city is a wonderful example of it. I suspect Walt Whitman came down to cruise sailors in this neighborhood. We can think about other wonderful things like the Cognac Mermaid Parade. So I want to end with some queer maritime things I've seen recently. There was a lot of maritime stuff in Trans Pride. London is another great port city, of course, and that makes a lot of sense. That reminds us of the very queer love of pirates, including the beloved figures of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. These are AFAB pirates. We might think of them as cross-dressers, maybe trans-masked, up to interpretation, up for interpretation. The community researchers I work with and the terror camp people in London did incredible work on a queer pirate section of this exhibit that's up at the London Maritime Museum right now, including wonderful artistic work, really cool imaginative things. I have a copy of this scene as well if anyone wants to look. There's some wonderful tattoo stuff back there, so and that in fact is connected to some very interesting queer history too. So we can talk about that later. My research shows, in my research period, the age of sail shows that there was a powerful connection between sexual and gender difference in sailors that stretches back to the 15th century, the 16th century, and later, and of course this still has a huge presence in queer communities. I'm working on another research project right now, only tangentially connected to this, where I've been reading through a lot of copies of the old gay travel guide Spartacus. Do people know about Spartacus? The This was a very influential European gay travel guide published between 1970 and 2016. It's a horrible app now. But the paper copies are really lovely, and when you flip through them, there's so much naval stuff. It's incredible. Of course, Tom of Finland sailors were being knocked off here. I was really shocked to see that apparently there were a lot of gay clubs called. Don't know what to think about that. But there it is. So this is really important. It has a really, really long history. It is founded on something. I'll end by thanking you for thanking this museum for holding this event, thanking you for having me here. I'm getting to talk to you all, and I'm not getting to talk to the U.S. Naval Academy for the big annual symposium that starts tomorrow, in fact, so their loss is your gain, I hope. I have a paper about Patrick O'Brien about the Master and Commander books. People read those? So this is very gay if you've read them. I noticed that. There's been a real crackdown at the U.S. Naval Academy under the Trump administration. Apparently our Secretary of Defense, I guess he's our Secretary of War now, right? He periodically sobers up enough to try to do censorship at the Naval Academy. So my paper was bold, so there is in fact a lot of fighting about whether or not this can happen. There is censorship. I'm a very small victim of those people that I think the word censored and suffering much more extreme ways than me. But this is a battleground for culture war, and I'm really grateful for this institution that you support so much for your program, because this is real history. It really matters. So yeah, thank you. Thank you all.
Yeah.